The pill bottle sat on my grandmother's kitchen table like a ticking time bomb, its orange plastic reflecting the morning light that streamed through windows she could barely afford to keep clean. Inside were exactly 9 insulin pens, 3 days' worth of the medication that kept Dorothy Washington alive, kept her blood sugar stable, kept her heart beating, and her mind sharp at 74 years old. In 3 days, when those pens were gone, we would face a choice that no family should ever have to make in the wealthiest country in human history. Watch my grandmother slowly die from diabetic complications, or somehow find $847 for a month's supply of medicine that cost pennies to manufacture, but was priced like liquid gold by pharmaceutical companies that had turned human survival into a profit center. I had spent the last week calling every insurance company, every assistance program, every family member who might have money to lend. I had researched generic alternatives, patient assistance programs, even considered driving to Canada, where the same medication cost a fraction of what American pharmacies charged. But every door had closed, every option had been exhausted, every hope had been reduced to the mathematical reality that my grandmother's life had a price tag we couldn't afford to pay. 3 days to find $847 we didn't have, or watch the strongest woman I knew slowly die because we couldn't afford to keep her alive. That's when I started considering options that went against everything she had taught me about right and wrong, legal and illegal, the difference between surviving with integrity and surviving at any cost. My name is Jamal Washington, and my grandmother was dying because she was poor in America. Not dying because she was old or sick beyond treatment or had given up hope, but dying because pharmaceutical companies had decided that the insulin her body needed to process sugar, insulin that had been discovered 99 years earlier and should have been affordable for everyone who needed it, was worth more as a commodity than as a medicine. Grandma Dorothy had been diabetic for 32 years, since she was 42 and I was just a baby. She had managed her condition through careful diet, regular exercise, and the discipline that comes from understanding that neglecting your health when you can't afford medical emergencies is a luxury that working-class families can't afford. For 3 decades, she had been the model patient, checking her blood sugar multiple times per day, rotating injection sites to prevent tissue damage, maintaining the kind of meticulous self-care routine that doctors praised and insurance companies used as examples of patient compliance. Her diabetes had never been her identity, just another challenge she managed with the same determination she applied to raising 6 children as a single mother and working 47 years as a nurse's aide in hospitals that served the community where we lived. But diabetes is a progressive disease, and 32 years of managing blood sugar with pills and lifestyle changes had eventually required the transition to insulin when her pancreas could no longer produce enough natural hormone to keep her alive. The diagnosis wasn't a surprise. Her doctor had been preparing her for this transition for 3 years, but the cost of insulin had been a shock that neither of us had anticipated. When she started insulin therapy 6 months earlier, the monthly cost of her medication had jumped from $240 for oral diabetes drugs to $847 for the combination of rapid-acting and long-acting insulin pens that kept her blood sugar in the range that prevented heart attacks, strokes, kidney failure, and the slow death that comes from untreated diabetes. Medicare covered approximately 60% of the cost, but the remaining $340 per month exceeded what she could afford on her fixed income of $1,947 from Social Security. She had entered what insurance companies call the coverage gap, or donut hole, the period each year when patients pay full retail price for medications until they reach the catastrophic coverage threshold. But catastrophic coverage required spending over $5,000 out of pocket first, money that would take her entire Social Security income for 4 months. The system was designed to help people who could afford to spend thousands of dollars on medication before receiving assistance, but it provided no relief for people whose monthly income was barely enough to cover rent, utilities, and groceries. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Grandma needed medicine that cost more than she could afford, and without it, she would die within weeks from diabetic ketoacidosis, kidney failure, or cardiovascular complications that were preventable with proper medication, but fatal without it. I was 18 years old, 3 months out of high school, working part-time at a grocery store while trying to save money for community college. My income of $800 per month was barely enough to help with my own expenses, let alone contribute meaningfully to a medical crisis that required more money than our entire family earned. But I was also the person Grandma had called when the pharmacy told her that her insurance would no longer cover the full cost of her insulin. The person she trusted to help her navigate a healthcare system that seemed designed to exclude people like us. The grandson who had promised her that I would never let anything happen to her that I had the power to prevent. Have you ever watched someone you love choose between life-saving medication and paying rent? When you realize that in America, your grandmother's life has a price tag that changes based on corporate profits rather than human need? When you understood that the healthcare system treats medicine as a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a human right to be protected? That's where I found myself at 18, holding my grandmother's insulin pen and calculating how many days she could survive if we rationed her medication, how many weeks she might live if we reduced her doses, how long we had before her body would start the slow shutdown that comes from untreated diabetes. The medical reality of Grandma's condition was as precise as it was unforgiving. Type 1 diabetes, which typically develops in childhood, destroys the pancreas's ability to produce insulin completely. Type 2 diabetes, which Grandma had, gradually reduces insulin production over time until external insulin becomes necessary for survival. Without insulin, diabetic patients experience a condition called diabetic ketoacidosis, where blood sugar rises to levels that become toxic to every organ system. The symptoms progress predictably: excessive thirst and urination, rapid weight loss, nausea and vomiting, difficulty breathing, confusion, and eventually coma and death. The process isn't quick or peaceful. It's a slow deterioration that can take weeks, during which patients remain conscious and aware that they are dying from a condition that is completely treatable with medication that costs less than $10 to manufacture, but sells for over $300 per vial in American pharmacies. Grandma had already started showing early signs of insulin deficiency, increased thirst, more frequent urination, fatigue that she tried to hide by going to bed earlier, and the kind of irritability that comes when blood sugar levels make normal activities feel overwhelming. Her blood glucose monitor showed readings that were consistently above 250 mg/dL, levels that indicated her body was struggling to process basic nutrition without the insulin assistance that her failing pancreas could no longer provide. Normal blood sugar ranges from 80–120 mg/dL. Anything above 180 mg/dL starts causing organ damage. Readings above 300 mg/dL can trigger medical emergencies. But the numbers that mattered most weren't medical, they were financial. Her insulin regimen required 4 pens per month, 2 rapid-acting insulin pens for mealtime blood sugar control, and 2 long-acting insulin pens for baseline metabolism throughout the day. Each pen cost approximately $200, and without insurance coverage, the monthly total was $847. The pharmacy didn't care about love or family history, they cared about $847 we didn't have. The systemic failures that had led to Grandma's crisis weren't accidental. They were the predictable result of policies that treated healthcare as a business rather than a public service, that prioritized pharmaceutical profits over patient survival, that created insurance systems designed to limit coverage rather than ensure access to necessary medications. Insulin was discovered in 1922 by researchers who sold the patent to the University of Toronto for $1 because they believed that no one should die from lack of access to a medication that could be produced inexpensively and distributed widely. But nearly a century later, 3 pharmaceutical companies controlled 90% of the global insulin market and had increased prices by over 300% in the past decade. The same medication that cost $40 per vial in neighboring Canada cost $300 per vial in American pharmacies, not because of differences in manufacturing costs or regulatory requirements, but because American healthcare policy allowed pharmaceutical companies to charge whatever the market would bear for medications that patients needed to survive. Medicare, the insurance program designed to provide healthcare security for elderly Americans, had been structured with coverage gaps that forced patients to pay full retail prices for medications during certain periods of the year. The donut hole meant that after spending approximately $3,000 on covered medications annually, patients paid 100% of costs until they reached the catastrophic coverage threshold of $5,000 in out-of-pocket expenses. For patients like Grandma, whose total Social Security income was barely enough to cover basic living expenses, the donut hole created an impossible choice: spend money she didn't have on life-saving medication or ration medicine and risk diabetic complications that could be fatal. The patient assistance programs offered by pharmaceutical companies required documentation of financial hardship, but the application processes took weeks or months to complete, and approval wasn't guaranteed. Even when approved, the programs often provided only partial assistance, leaving patients responsible for co-payments that could still exceed their ability to pay. State and federal assistance programs existed in theory, but waiting lists for medication assistance often extended for months, and eligibility requirements excluded people whose income was slightly above poverty thresholds, even when their medical expenses consumed most of their earnings. The cruelest irony was that emergency room treatment for diabetic ketoacidosis cost approximately $15,000 per episode, paid for by taxpayers through emergency Medicaid coverage, while preventive insulin therapy cost less than $1,000 per month and would prevent the emergency entirely. The system was designed to pay for expensive crisis intervention rather than affordable prevention. But systems and policies and pharmaceutical profits were abstractions when I was sitting in Grandma's kitchen, watching her ration insulin doses and calculate how many days she could survive on the medication we could afford rather than the medication she needed. I had found a way to get the money, but the cost might be everything I believed about myself. The exhaustion of legitimate options had taken 2 weeks of phone calls, research, and applications that led nowhere. Every insurance representative I spoke with explained the rules with bureaucratic sympathy, but couldn't change the mathematics that left us $340 short of being able to afford Grandma's medication. Family members who might have been able to help were facing their own financial challenges, or were already providing assistance to other relatives dealing with medical emergencies, unemployment, or the accumulated economic pressures that seemed to affect everyone in our community simultaneously. My aunts and uncles loved Grandma deeply, but they were supporting their own families on incomes that didn't allow for unexpected medical expenses that exceeded most people's monthly rent payments. The few relatives who had savings were already helping other family members facing evictions, car repairs, or their own healthcare crises. I had applied for emergency assistance through every community organization, religious institution, and nonprofit agency that offered help with medical expenses. But most programs were designed to assist with utility bills or temporary food assistance rather than ongoing prescription costs that exceeded what entire families spent on housing. The applications I submitted required documentation of income, medical necessity, and financial hardship that took weeks to process. And most programs had funding limitations that meant assistance was available on a first-come, first-served basis until money ran out for the fiscal year. Even the pharmaceutical company that manufactured Grandma's insulin offered a patient assistance program, but the application process required 3 weeks for approval, and we had 3 days before her current supply would be exhausted. The local pharmacy had offered a payment plan that would allow us to spread the cost over several months, but the monthly payments would still exceed what we could afford while maintaining rent, utilities, and groceries. Delaying the crisis wasn't the same as solving it. I had researched driving to Canada to purchase insulin at Canadian prices, but the logistics were complicated by prescription requirements, border regulations, and transportation costs that would eliminate most of the savings while requiring time we didn't have. Every legitimate avenue I explored led to the same conclusion. The systems that were supposed to provide healthcare security for elderly Americans had failed my grandmother, and no legal solution could generate $847 in the 72 hours we had remaining. When every legal option fails, desperation starts to look rational. That's when I started researching options that I would never have considered under normal circumstances. Paths that violated every principle Grandma had taught me about honesty and integrity, but which might be the only way to keep her alive long enough to find a sustainable solution to her ongoing medication needs. The first option I considered was theft. Walking into a pharmacy and taking the insulin she needed, accepting the legal consequences as the price of keeping her alive. But pharmacy security made theft nearly impossible, and getting arrested would leave Grandma without anyone to help her navigate the crisis. The second option was fraud, creating false documentation that would qualify her for assistance programs she didn't technically qualify for, or misrepresenting our family's financial situation to access emergency funds designated for people in even more desperate circumstances. But the option that seemed most feasible, most likely to generate the money we needed quickly enough to matter, was drug dealing. Not hard drugs that destroyed communities, but marijuana sales that could generate significant income with relatively low legal risk, especially if I was careful about quantities and avoided selling to minors. I spent hours researching the economics of marijuana distribution, the legal penalties for possession and sales, the logistics of finding suppliers and customers without drawing police attention. The mathematics were compelling. $847 could be earned in a week through careful sales to college students and working adults who were already purchasing marijuana from other sources. The moral justification seemed clear. I would be providing a product that adults chose to purchase, generating income through voluntary transactions that harmed no one, breaking laws that most experts agreed were unjust and counterproductive. But the deeper I researched, the more I understood that crossing that line would change something fundamental about who I was and who I could become. Getting involved in drug sales, even temporarily, even for the best possible reasons, would connect me to networks and activities that could spiral beyond my control. I had found a way to get the money, but the cost might be everything I believed about myself. The internal warfare between saving Grandma's life and preserving my own integrity consumed every moment of the next 48 hours. I researched suppliers, mapped potential customer bases, and calculated risk-to-reward ratios while simultaneously exploring every remaining legal option that might provide an alternative. The moral mathematics seemed straightforward. Grandma's life was worth more than my theoretical concerns about drug laws that criminalized substances that were legal in neighboring states and would likely be legal nationwide within a few years. Breaking unjust laws to save someone's life felt like civil disobedience rather than criminal behavior. But the practical considerations were more complex. Getting arrested would leave Grandma without support during her medical crisis. Getting involved with drug distribution could expose me to violence from competitors or customers. Building a customer base would require ongoing involvement rather than temporary transactions, potentially trapping me in activities that became harder to exit over time. Most importantly, I realized that Grandma would be devastated if she learned that I had compromised my values and risked my future to solve a problem that wasn't my responsibility to solve. She had spent 18 years teaching me about making ethical choices under pressure, about finding legal solutions to difficult problems, about building character that would serve me throughout my life. Saving her life by becoming someone she would be ashamed of felt like a victory that was actually a defeat, a solution that solved the immediate crisis while creating problems that could last for years. But as I sat in her kitchen on the second night, watching her check her blood sugar and calculate how many insulin doses remained, I realized that philosophical concerns about character and integrity were luxuries I could afford only if there were alternatives that didn't require her to die while I maintained my moral purity. 72 hours to choose between losing my grandmother and losing my soul. That's when I discovered an option that I had overlooked during my initial research, not because it was hidden, but because it required the kind of intensive effort and personal risk that made drug dealing seem simple by comparison. Emergency freelance work that could generate substantial income in short periods through skills I already possessed, if I was willing to work around the clock and take on projects that most people my age wouldn't be capable of completing under extreme time pressure. I had been building websites and managing social media accounts for small businesses since I was 16, earning modest income through part-time projects that supplemented my grocery store wages. But I had never attempted to scale those services to the level that could generate serious money quickly. The opportunity came through research into businesses that needed immediate digital marketing assistance for time-sensitive projects, product launches, event promotions, crisis management situations where companies needed comprehensive online strategies implemented within days rather than weeks. I found 3 businesses that were facing digital marketing emergencies: a restaurant that needed a complete online ordering system built and launched before a major food festival, a retail store that needed crisis management after negative social media reviews went viral, and a fitness studio that needed membership management software implemented before their grand opening. Each project would typically require weeks of development time, but if I worked continuously for 72 hours, surviving on caffeine and determination, I could potentially complete all 3 projects and earn the $847 we needed for Grandma's medication. The risk was enormous. If I failed to deliver professional results under impossible deadlines, I would damage my reputation while still facing the same medical crisis. The physical and mental demands of working 3 days without sleep while maintaining the quality standards that professional clients expected would test every limit of endurance and capability. But the alternative was crossing moral lines that could change who I was permanently, or watching my grandmother die because I wasn't willing to work hard enough to save her life through legitimate means. I rejected the unthinkable and chose the impossible, proving that an 18-year-old's determination could move mountains. The next 72 hours became a blur of coding, designing, problem-solving, and client communication that tested every skill I had developed and required me to learn new capabilities in real time. I worked from Grandma's kitchen table, surrounded by medical supplies and insulin pens that served as constant reminders of what was at stake. The restaurant project required building a complete e-commerce website with online ordering functionality, payment processing integration, and inventory management systems that could handle the increased volume they expected during the food festival. I had never built anything that complex, but I researched continuously while coding, learning new programming techniques and platform integrations as each challenge arose. The retail store crisis management required monitoring and responding to hundreds of social media comments, developing messaging strategies that acknowledged customer concerns while protecting the business's reputation, and implementing automated systems that could maintain positive engagement long-term. The skills were familiar, but the scale and urgency were unlike anything I had managed previously. The fitness studio membership management system required database design, user interface development, and integration with payment processing and scheduling systems that could handle their anticipated membership growth. The technical requirements were demanding, but the client was willing to pay premium rates for delivery before their opening date. Each project required continuous communication with clients who were initially skeptical about hiring an 18-year-old for critical business functions, but who became increasingly confident as I delivered progress updates that demonstrated both technical competence and professional reliability. By the end of the first day, I had completed approximately 30% of each project and had proven to all 3 clients that I could deliver results that justified their investment. But I was also exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness, mentally depleted from solving complex problems under extreme pressure while maintaining the focus necessary for error-free coding. The second day required pushing through exhaustion that made concentration difficult, but the progress I was making gave me confidence that the strategy could succeed. I was building momentum with each completed feature, each satisfied client, each small victory that brought me closer to earning the money Grandma needed. But the most important realization was that I was discovering capabilities I didn't know I possessed. The ability to work at professional levels under impossible pressure, to learn new skills in real time when failure wasn't an option, to manage multiple complex projects simultaneously while maintaining quality standards that exceeded client expectations. Every hour that passed brought us closer to crisis, but it also brought me closer to proving that legitimate solutions existed for problems that seemed to require desperate measures. With 6 hours left before her medication ran out, I finally found someone willing to believe in miracles. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on the third day, when I submitted the final elements of all 3 projects and received approval from clients who had been monitoring my progress throughout the weekend. The restaurant owner was amazed by the online ordering system that could handle the complexity of their menu and seasonal variations. The retail store manager was relieved by the social media strategy that had already improved their online ratings and customer feedback. The fitness studio owner was impressed by the membership management system that could scale with their business growth. But more than satisfaction with the work itself, all 3 clients were impressed by the circumstances that had motivated my performance. A teenage grandson working around the clock to earn money for his grandmother's life-saving medication, proving that personal investment in outcomes could produce results that went beyond what established professionals might deliver. "Marcus," the restaurant owner said during our final phone call, "I've worked with marketing agencies that charged 5 times what you charged and delivered half the results. What you accomplished this weekend proves that caring about outcomes matters more than having credentials." The payments from all 3 projects totaled $1,240, enough to cover Grandma's medication with money left over for next month's initial expenses, providing breathing room to develop sustainable solutions rather than just managing immediate crises. But the most important achievement wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I had found a way to solve an impossible problem through legitimate means, that I had honored the values Grandma had taught me while proving that determination could overcome circumstances that seemed designed to force people into desperation. Walking into the pharmacy with enough money to fill Grandma's prescription felt like the most powerful moment of my 18 years. Not because of the money itself, but because of what earning it had proved about the difference between giving up and getting creative, between accepting limitations and creating solutions. I had saved my grandmother's life, but I had also saved my own soul in the process. The pharmacist, who had been apologetically explaining insurance limitations and payment options for the past week, looked genuinely surprised when I handed him cash for the full prescription amount. "Your grandmother is lucky to have someone who cares about her this much," he said while processing the payment. "I see too many elderly patients who can't afford their medications and don't have family members willing or able to help." When I brought the insulin home and placed the new supply in Grandma's refrigerator, she cried tears that were different from any tears I had seen her cry before. Not tears of pain or frustration or defeat, but tears of gratitude and disbelief that the crisis had been resolved. "Baby," she said, holding the insulin pens like they were precious treasures. "How did you get this money? Please tell me you didn't do anything dangerous or illegal." I explained the 3 projects, the 72 hours of continuous work, the clients who had been willing to pay premium rates for emergency delivery of professional services they needed immediately. "You did all that for me?" she asked. "I did all that because you taught me that family takes care of family, that problems exist to be solved rather than accepted, and that the right way might be harder than the wrong way, but it's always worth the extra effort. What would you do to keep someone you love alive? When does the healthcare system's failure become your moral emergency? Have you ever faced the choice between watching someone die from treatable conditions or doing whatever it takes to keep them alive?" These weren't abstract questions anymore. They were the realities I had lived through, the choices I had made, and the lessons I carried forward into a completely different understanding of what was possible when desperation met determination. The transformation that followed wasn't just about solving Grandma's immediate medication crisis. It was about building sustainable systems that could prevent similar crises for our family and others facing the same impossible choices between healthcare and financial survival. Within 6 months, I had expanded my digital marketing services into a full-time business that generated enough monthly income to cover Grandma's medical expenses while building savings for future healthcare emergencies. But more importantly, I had developed expertise in navigating healthcare bureaucracy, insurance systems, and patient assistance programs that made me valuable to other families facing similar challenges. I started volunteer work with a local organization that helped elderly community members apply for medication assistance, navigate insurance appeals, and access resources that could reduce their healthcare costs. The combination of technical skills and personal experience with healthcare crises made me unusually effective at helping people find solutions they hadn't known existed. The most rewarding part of the work was connecting with other young adults who were caring for elderly relatives while trying to build their own futures, sharing strategies for managing caregiver responsibilities while pursuing education and career goals that could provide long-term stability for entire families. Her medicine cabinet was full again, but more importantly, I had learned that impossible was just another word for what no one had tried yet. 1 year after that terrifying countdown to medical crisis, Grandma's diabetes was better controlled than it had been in years. Not just because her medication was consistent, but because our improved financial situation allowed for better nutrition, regular medical monitoring, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing that healthcare needs wouldn't force impossible choices. The business I had built during that desperate weekend had grown into a regional consulting firm that specialized in emergency digital marketing services for small businesses facing time-sensitive challenges. The willingness to work under extreme pressure to deliver professional results when failure wasn't an option had created a competitive advantage that generated premium pricing from clients who needed immediate solutions. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't business growth or financial stability. It was the healthcare advocacy program I had developed to help other families navigate the complex systems that made basic medical care unaffordable for people who needed it most. The program connected families facing medication crises with resources, volunteers, and emergency assistance that could bridge gaps between immediate needs and long-term solutions. We had helped 47 families avoid rationing life-saving medications, connected 83 people with patient assistance programs they qualified for but hadn't known existed, and successfully appealed insurance denials for 31 people whose coverage had been inappropriately terminated. What Jamal built, the director of our local community health center told a newspaper reporter, is proof that healthcare crises require both individual solutions and systemic change. He solved his grandmother's immediate problem while creating resources that help other families solve similar problems before they become life-threatening emergencies. The most meaningful part of the work was hearing from other young adults who had been inspired by our story to pursue their own solutions rather than accepting that their elderly relatives would have to choose between medication and basic living expenses. 2 years after watching Grandma ration insulin doses, I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee about the impact of prescription drug pricing on elderly Americans and the role that community-based advocacy could play in addressing healthcare access issues. Representatives, I began. 2 years ago, I was an 18-year-old facing the choice between watching my grandmother die from diabetes complications or finding $847 for medication that costs pennies to manufacture, but was priced beyond our ability to pay. I presented research about the correlation between prescription drug costs and medication adherence among elderly patients, statistics about emergency room visits that could be prevented through affordable access to maintenance medications, and policy recommendations for addressing the coverage gaps that forced families into crisis situations. The most important lesson I learned, I explained, is that healthcare emergencies require both immediate solutions and systematic changes. Individual families can solve immediate crises through determination and creativity, but sustainable healthcare security requires policies that treat medicine as a human right rather than a consumer commodity. I outlined proposals for state legislation that would cap out-of-pocket costs for essential medications, create emergency prescription assistance funds, and establish advocacy programs that helped families navigate insurance systems and access available resources. Healthcare shouldn't be a luxury that only wealthy families can afford, I concluded. Every grandmother should be able to access the medication she needs to live with dignity and security, and every grandson should be able to focus on building his future rather than choosing between education and keeping his family members alive. The committee received my testimony with the seriousness that healthcare advocacy deserves, but the conversation that meant the most came afterward, when a representative approached me privately. "My mother is facing similar challenges with medication costs," she said. "After hearing your testimony, I want to learn more about the advocacy resources you've developed. This isn't just policy for me, it's personal." That conversation reminded me that healthcare crises affect families across every demographic, every income level, every political affiliation. The systems that had failed my grandmother were failing people throughout our community, and the solutions that had worked for us could work for others if they had access to information, resources, and support networks. 3 years after that desperate weekend when I worked 72 hours to earn $847, I was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for the state university's public health program. Standing at that podium, looking out at graduates who would spend their careers addressing healthcare challenges, I thought about the journey that had brought me from crisis to advocacy, from individual solutions to systemic change. 3 years ago, I told them, I was forced to choose between my moral principles and my grandmother's survival, between following legal pathways that led nowhere and finding creative solutions that existed outside traditional systems. I talked about the importance of understanding that healthcare crises are also moral emergencies, that families facing impossible choices need both immediate assistance and long-term advocacy, and that the most effective solutions often come from people who have personal experience with the problems they're trying to solve. Some of you will work in hospitals and clinics, treating patients who arrive in crisis situations that could have been prevented through affordable access to basic medications, I continued. Some of you will develop policies that determine whether families like mine face impossible choices or have realistic options for managing chronic conditions. I looked out at faces that represented the next generation of healthcare professionals, people who would determine whether the systems that had failed my grandmother would be reformed or perpetuated. What I want you to remember, I concluded, is that behind every healthcare statistic is a family facing real consequences, that behind every policy decision is someone's grandmother counting pills and calculating how many days she can survive. and that the most important question you can ask in your careers is whether the systems you're working within serve human dignity or just institutional efficiency. The applause was generous, but the moment that mattered most came afterward, when a graduate named Sarah approached me with tears in her eyes. "My grandfather is diabetic," she said. "He's been rationing his insulin for 6 months, and our family has been trying to figure out what to do. After hearing your speech, I think there might be resources we haven't explored." I gave her my contact information and offered to connect her family with the advocacy network we had built. "The most important thing," I told her, "is understanding that rationing life-saving medication is never acceptable, and that solutions exist if you're willing to work hard enough to find them or create them yourself."
4 years after that terrifying countdown to medical emergency, I was preparing to start my sophomore year at State University, having deferred enrollment to build our business, but finally ready to combine formal education with real-world experience in healthcare advocacy and policy development.
The business was stable enough to cover both Grandma's ongoing medical expenses and my educational costs, and I had decided that the best way to serve our community was to develop additional expertise in public health policy and healthcare administration that could amplify the impact of the advocacy work I had already started. But the most meaningful achievement wasn't business success or educational plans. It was the knowledge that Grandma's medicine cabinet would never be empty again, and that the crisis that had almost destroyed our family had become the foundation for helping other families avoid similar emergencies. On the 4th anniversary of that weekend, when I worked 3 days straight to earn money for insulin, Grandma and I celebrated by hosting a community dinner for families who had been helped by our advocacy program. Her kitchen, which had once been the site of rationing life-saving medication, was now the center of a gathering that proved healthcare crises could become catalysts for community solidarity and systematic change. During the dinner, Grandma gave a speech that brought tears to everyone's eyes, but especially to mine. 4 years ago, she said, standing in the kitchen where I had watched her count insulin pens like they were precious gems, "I thought I was going to die because I couldn't afford to live." What my grandson taught me is that healthcare isn't just about medicine. It's about love made practical, family made responsible, and communities made stronger through caring for each other. She looked directly at me. What Jamal built wasn't just a way to pay for my medication. It was proof that young people can solve problems that adults have accepted as unchangeable, that individual crises can become community solutions, and that the most important inheritance I could give him was teaching him to care about other people's grandmothers as much as he cared about his own. The applause was heartfelt, but what meant the most to me was the conversation Grandma and I had later that evening, sitting at her kitchen table, the same table where we had calculated how many days her medication would last, where I had planned the business that saved her life, where we had learned that impossible was just another word for what no one had tried yet. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had chosen the other path?" she asked. "If you had decided to make money through illegal means instead of working 3 days straight?" I thought about that alternate timeline for a moment. The person I might have become if desperation had overcome principle. The problems that short-term solutions might have created. The ways that compromising my values could have changed the trajectory of my entire life. "I think," I said finally, "I would have saved your life, but lost myself in the process. And I think you would have been heartbroken knowing that your medical crisis had forced me to become someone you couldn't be proud of." Grandma nodded. "What you proved is that love doesn't require sacrifice of principle. It requires creative application of principle. You didn't save my life by becoming someone else. You saved my life by becoming more yourself than you had ever been before." "What's the most important thing you want me to remember as I continue this work?" I asked. Grandma smiled. "That sometimes saving one life teaches you how to save many lives, and that the unthinkable becomes unnecessary when you're willing to do the incredible instead." 5 years after that desperate weekend, I graduated from State University with degrees in public health and business administration, having completed my education while continuing to run the advocacy program that had grown into a statewide network serving families facing healthcare crises throughout our region. But the moment that brought everything full circle came during my graduation ceremony, when Grandma stood up in the audience, healthier and more secure than she had been in years, and cheered loud enough for everyone to hear when my name was called. After the ceremony, we celebrated at her house with a family dinner that included 43 people from our extended family and advocacy network. The same kitchen that had once held exactly 9 insulin pens and 3 days of hope was now overflowing with food, laughter, and the knowledge that healthcare crises could be prevented through community action, policy advocacy, and the refusal to accept that anyone should die from treatable conditions because they couldn't afford treatment. The advocacy program had grown into a regional nonprofit organization that employed 8 people, had helped over 300 families navigate healthcare emergencies, and had successfully lobbied for state legislation that capped out-of-pocket prescription costs for essential medications and created emergency assistance funds for families facing medical crises. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't organizational growth or policy success. It was the knowledge that I had found a way to transform personal crisis into community service. That I had honored the values Grandma had taught me while proving that those values could create real-world change when applied with determination and creativity. 6 years after watching my grandmother count insulin pens like they were diamonds, I was invited to address a national conference on healthcare advocacy and community organizing. Standing at that podium, representing not just my own family's experience, but the experiences of hundreds of families whose crises had become catalysts for systematic change, I felt the weight of responsibility that comes with platforms that can influence policy and inspire action. 6 years ago, I began, I was an 18-year-old facing the choice between watching my grandmother die from diabetes complications or compromising everything she had taught me about integrity and character to generate money for medication that should have been affordable for everyone who needed it. I shared research about the correlation between prescription drug pricing and health outcomes, statistics about families who were forced to choose between medication and basic living expenses, and policy recommendations for creating healthcare systems that served human dignity rather than corporate profits. The most important lesson I learned, I explained, is that individual solutions and systematic change aren't competing approaches. They're complementary strategies that reinforce each other. Families facing immediate crises need emergency assistance, but sustainable healthcare security requires policies that prevent emergencies from occurring in the first place. I outlined models for community-based healthcare advocacy that connected immediate assistance with long-term policy change, emphasizing the importance of including people with lived experience of healthcare crises in the development of solutions that affected their lives. Healthcare advocacy isn't about charity or sympathy, I concluded. It's about justice, dignity, and the understanding that in the wealthiest society in human history, no one should die from treatable conditions because they can't afford treatment. Every grandmother should be able to access life-saving medication, and every grandson should be able to focus on building his future, rather than choosing between education and keeping his family members alive. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just recognition of the speech, it was acknowledgement that healthcare crises require both individual courage and collective action, that families like mine weren't isolated cases, but examples of systematic problems that could be solved through sustained effort and policy reform. After the conference, several organizations approached me about expanding our advocacy model to other states, about developing training programs for young adults who wanted to help their communities navigate healthcare challenges, and about policy research that could inform federal legislation addressing prescription drug pricing and healthcare access. But the conversation that meant the most came from a college student who approached me after my presentation. "My grandmother is diabetic too," he said. "She's been rationing her insulin, and our family didn't know there were advocacy resources that could help. After hearing your story, I want to learn how to build something similar in our community." I gave him my contact information and offered to provide training and resources for starting healthcare advocacy work in his area. "The most important thing," I told him, "is understanding that your grandmother's life has value that goes beyond any price tag, and that systems that force families to choose between medication and survival can be changed by people who refuse to accept unacceptable realities." That conversation reminded me that our story had never been just about my grandmother's insulin or my desperate weekend of work. It had been about proving that healthcare crises could become catalysts for community organizing, that individual determination could inspire systematic change, and that the most effective advocacy comes from people who have personal stakes in the outcomes they're fighting to achieve. If you believe that healthcare is a human right rather than a consumer commodity, that no one should die from treatable conditions because they can't afford treatment, and that sometimes saving one life teaches you how to save many lives, then this story matters to you too. Subscribe for more stories about young people who refused to accept that their family members would die from treatable conditions, who learned that individual determination and systematic change reinforce each other, and who discovered that the most important question isn't whether you can afford health care, but whether society can afford to let people die from poverty in the midst of abundance. Because that weekend, working 72 hours straight to earn money for my grandmother's insulin taught me something no classroom ever could: that some choices are too important to compromise on, some people are too precious to let die, and some problems are too urgent to solve through normal channels when normal channels have failed. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that medicine cabinets should never be empty when lives depend on being full, that healthcare emergencies require both immediate action and long-term advocacy, and that sometimes the unthinkable becomes unnecessary when you're willing to do the incredible instead. Because sometimes saving one life teaches you how to save many lives, and sometimes the greatest honor you can give the person who raised you is proving that their investment in your character created someone willing to fight for justice that extends beyond your own family to include everyone's grandmother, everyone's medication, everyone's right to live with dignity regardless of their ability to pay.